afternoon, guys. What we're going to talk about today is how to make a simple shooting bag for a gun, maybe like a flintlock type firearm. Something that you're going to want a traditional looking shooting bag to go with that gun to carry your bullets, patches, and different things you need to keep that gun happy. What we're going to make this bag out of is a coonskin. This is from a coon that I trapped and tanned earlier in the year, or actually last fall. And when you skin these small fur-bearing animals like this, a lot of times you case skin them, which means that you basically wring the skin up close to the tail and pull it off past the head, and you're left with a hollow tooth. And this skin, I cut the head up above the shoulders. I cut that off of the skin. So now I'm left with this. And I looked at this and thought, man, if you stitched up that bottom, then you'd have a perfect shooting bag flap with this tail and rear end area. So what we're going to try to do today is I'm just going to have to cut a little bit more of this off to get rid of these leg holes. Cut that off, stitch it up, and we should have a pretty neat shooting bag with a coontail flap on it. And then in part 2 of this video, we will look at attaching a strap. So real quick, let's look at what we're going to need to do this project, the tools. Got my haversack right here. And the first thing that we're going to need is some way to punch holes in this skin. And you can use a rotary punch, you can use a nail, you can drill holes in this, whatever you want to do. What I'm going to use today is a crooked awl. And a crooked awl, or moccasin awl, was a very common trade item on the frontier. So I thought this would be appropriate to use for this project, and it's something you can carry easily in a backpack or haversack into the woods with you. It's basically an awl with a round sharp end here and a square sharp end here, and it's crooked, so you can really grab onto this thing and bore into whatever you need to drill real easy. We're also going to want a needle and thread. And I carry my sewing stuff for leather projects in this little thing I made. It's just a square of leather with 2 holes punched in it, so you can kind of weave a needle in there, and then you can wrap it around a piece of thread. This is just a heavy duty needle, leather sewing needle, and this is some hemp thread, small diameter hemp thread, and we're going to wax it before we actually start this project. And on top of all those things, you're just going to want a good sharp knife, and I'm just going to use my belt knife for this. So the first thing that we need to do is cut this off just below this leg hole. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut this. I'm not doing any measurements on this thing or anything. Just going to eyeball it. Should turn out good. Just want to cut this as straight as you can. Alright, so that's pretty much all we need to do there. There's going to be some fur that's going to come off with that, but that's going to give us the body of our bag. It's basically going to be this area here, which is a pretty small bag, but according to some records that we have, most long hunters would typically carry about a 7-inch square bag. And really, if you think about it, that will hold everything you need for a day out hunting or shooting. So this bag should be plenty big enough. So now what we're going to do is flip this inside out That way we're not searching through this fur to find where we need to punch our holes at. So I'm just going to do that real quick. And this is not a project that you want to do inside, because you'll get fur everywhere. Alright, so now I've got this turned inside out and we can start punching. The side has a few rust spots on it. That's not going to be a problem. So now you're going to want a good hard flat surface for this that you don't need to worry about damaging, because we're going to be drilling straight through the skin into this stump. So I'm just going to take my awl, punch it through there, come out the other side. And because this is a case skin like this, a tube, we only need to sew across the bottom. Quick straight line. So the main thing to worry about here to keep your holes nice and even is make sure that you don't roll the skin like that. Just keep it in one position and you should be alright. Just drilling these holes about a 1/4 inch, a little less than that apart. Should be pretty good. And it's not a big deal to come in here as you're sewing and re-punch any of these holes that didn't end up the right size if you have to. And if you'll notice, I'm putting these holes right here about pretty far down from where I actually cut this, because I didn't cut it completely even on both sides, and I want to have a straight line of stitching, even if that means I'm not using all of my hide. That's why I'm punching it in this area. Looking good on the back side. We'll just keep plugging away at this. We're already about halfway done. This is not a long process at all. We only have about 6 inches or so of area that we need to worry about punching. If you would like to try this project yourself, you can buy coonskins commercially, or you can do it like I did and tan it yourself. I would recommend, if you are new at tanning, that you check out Hide Tanning Formula. I know that you can buy it at Self-Reliance Outfitters as well as some trapping supply houses. And it is basically a lotion that you buy and just squirt on that hide and rub it in real well, and it tans it. And that bottle comes with instructions on how to use it and everything, and you don't have to worry about, trying out, squirting eggs and vinegar all over that hide or other methods I've seen. It's just real simple. And you could even try this process out with a skunk skin or something different. We're almost done punching, and then sewing should be the easy part, hopefully. You can even use this crooked awl almost like a bit and brace, and grab it with both hands and drill it in there good if you find that you need to. Alright, I think that takes care of all my holes. So now we're ready to stitch this thing up. And there's several ways that you can sew leather. My preferred method is to just over-under stitch it. I'm not exactly sure what that's called. And I'll do that going one direction and then come back doing it the other way. That way it's filled in between each hole, not every other hole. So your thread needs to be about 3 or 4 times longer than the area you intend to sew. I'll go ahead and measure that. And I'll just go ahead and do 5 times the length we're sewing plus a little extra, because I like to be able to tie good sturdy notches in there and everything. Now we just need to wax this cordage. So I'm just going to run it along this cake of beeswax right here. And waxing just lets it go through the hole easier and protects it. Now we'll thread our needle. Which is always a tricky thing to do. And we're ready to start sewing. Just start in your first hole. Pull your thread through. And you want to leave just a few inches to tie this off when you're done. And now we just come up this hole and then down through this hole. Pull our needle through. Now we come up again Got to punch this hole out just a little bit. Up that hole and down the next one. We'll just keep doing this till we get all the way to the end, and then we'll go in the other direction. Make sure that you pull your thread good and tight, because this is going to be the bottom of your shooting bag. So it's going to be the only thing keeping your bullets and your tools that you need to shoot that gun from falling on the ground. So it needs to be sturdy. You may have noticed that these holes aren't exactly evenly spaced or in a straight line. And if you're working on a leather project like a knife sheath, it's really important that you get all those holes neat and even and all that good stuff. But on a fur project like this, that fur is going to cover up any mistakes you made for the most part, so it's not as important. There's a small hole in my coonskin right here. Just got to be careful around that. I don't think it's going to cause any problems as long as we sew everything else up real good. And if you'll notice, I'm using this little square of leather that I have my needle and thread wrapped up in to get a better grip on that needle to pull it through some of those tighter holes. It's just a quick tip. And for this pass with my needle, I need to come up through the leather. I'm just going to shove this needle down to find the correct hole. And you'll find that you sometimes have to do that. If you go through but you can't figure out what hole to use, you sometimes need to go the opposite way, kind of figure out where that is, and then sew through it the right way. the skin that was on the belly of this coon is fairly thin. So we just want to make sure that we're really careful that we don't rip that, because it is somewhat fragile in areas. Okay, now that I'm at the end of my sewing going one way, I need to turn around and go the other way. So I'm just going to flip this over and go through this hole. And just sew it backwards. And what you'll start to see is that now you're filling up the space between that first row of stitching, and that's just going to make your project a lot neater, and it's going to hold it together a lot better. Alright, so we've now completed sewing this across the top the second time, and we're ready to tie it off. So I'm just going to tie this in a simple square knot. So I'm going to take my two pieces and I'm going to go right over left and just tie that in a knot, and then left over right and tie it in a knot. And that should give you a good square knot. If you end up with a granny knot, which basically is a square knot but you didn't do it in the right order, that's no big deal. Now this is just something that I like to do to finish off my projects, and they'll last a little bit longer this way. After I tie the knot in this cordage, I like to sew a few holes after the knot, going back again, back across the top of here, this bag. That way, that thread, if it works out all the way to the knot and the knot comes undone, I have thread left over to retie that knot, and I don't have to tear apart the whole project and re-sew it. Another option is to take a little bit of leather glue or even hot glue or something like that and put a dab of that on your knot. But just pulling that thread through a few more holes is not tricky, and then you just cut it off and you're good to go. Still need to take this thread, sew it a few holes, piece of thread is short enough it keeps popping out of my needle every time I go through a hole. A little bit tricky. Alright. Now we've completed sewing the top of our bag. I'm just going to trim off some of this extra fur and leather. And now you'll notice I sewed this thing inside out. So I'm going to take and flip it now that it's stitched. Flip it back first side out. and that will place my seam on the inside of the bag, which just looks a little neater, especially on a fur piece like this. Looking at it from the front, you can't hardly tell that there's a seam there because it's on the inside. If I had sewed through that fur and left the edge showing right here unfinished, it wouldn't look very nice. But this way you can't see that raw edge of the leather, so it looks pretty good. So you can see I've created a pretty spacious bag here with a nice flap on it, coontail flap, and anything you do from here on out is personal preference. You could put a small button here. In part 2 of this short video series, I'll be attaching a strap to this bag. That's another option you can do. You can have a hand woven strap, you can have a leather strap, you can have just a piece of rope for a strap even. If you wanted to, you could paint or draw some kind of design on this leather on the inside of the flap. Anything you do from here on out is just personal preference, but this is a neat project to do because we've taken something that we gathered off the landscape, and there's so many skills involved in this. You have to know trapping, you have to be able to tan a skin, and then you have to be able to sew leather to make this. Now we can carry our shooting and hunting equipment in here when we go out and shoot more coons. So it's a neat project, it's a neat process, and just try it out. Thanks for watching.